Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2019, brought to you in partnership with our gold supporters, Barclays Access and Intopia, and with thanks to our silver supporters, Adobe and Siteimprove. Don't forget you can subscribe to Inclusive Design 24 on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 and hitting the subscribe button. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community with a code of conduct available on our website. And additionally, if you follow ID24 Conf on Twitter, and if you have questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag, and we'll ask them at the end of the session.
And on that note, do send us a tweet to @ID24Conf and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We've had people tweeting us to say they're in Chicago, and want to give a particular shout out to Kelsey in Massachusetts, who's part of the McDonald's accessibility team, who are globally distributed and watching from all sorts of bits of the planet. So hello to everyone watching. Without any more from us, I'd like to hand over to Andrew and Sarah, who are going to be talking about usability testing with people with disabilities.
Thank you so much, Leonie. Today, we wanted to share our experience in doing usability testing with people with disabilities. Up until a few years ago, at least in Australia, not a lot of usability testing was done with people with disabilities, except for if maybe you were designing a site or an application that was specifically targeted at people with disabilities. And so during the last sort of 3 or 4 years, we've been working with organisations here in Australia to get them to understand, I guess, why usability testing is important, and also trying to build skill in user research teams around how to conduct testing with people with disability. So we thought we'd distill some of those things that we are doing here today in our presentation. If you did want to tweet us, my Twitter handle is Sarah with TP, that's Sarah with an H, and you can find Andrew on Twitter as Amja, A-M-J-A. What we want to talk about today, first of all, we just want to briefly touch on the difference between technical accessibility testing versus usability testing and what the benefits are of usability testing, and then get into the nitty-gritty of actually doing the usability testing. So first of all, having a chat about who to include in your usability testing, when to do the testing through sort of the product lifecycle, how to plan for the session, how to go about recruitment, few tips for running the session, and then reporting your findings from that session.
So just almost as a refresher, we tend to say that technical testing will verify that each function of what it is that you've built will operate in the way that you expected it to. So that's really, and then, you know, if we're talking about accessibility, does it meet the WCAG requirements, and have you met those things in first instance? So if we think about a level of accessibility from something that's, you know, essential to be able to do the job, then WCAG conformance meets that, and you get that essential level or low level of usability as well, because some of WCAG is about usability, but it's really saying that WCAG is the essential part before you can build on that towards a satisfying experience.
When we talk about usability testing, it's really about understanding a user's experience and how easy it is for a group of representative users to actually complete typical tasks. We don't tend to get that with the technical accessibility. We're testing against standards, but we're not able to actually look at, is someone being able to complete a task effectively and efficiently? And they're words that you often find in the definition for usability. You know, how effective or efficient can someone actually perform a task? When we talk about effectiveness, we're often talking about accuracy and completeness. So can someone effectively complete a task? Can they do it accurately? Can they do it hopefully without any errors? Efficiency usually is measured by time on task. So is a person spending too much time? And we do want to acknowledge here that when we do test with people with disabilities, time on task can vary. So you don't want to compare that time on task, say, to other users. It might more be, are they able to do things, you know, efficiently and effectively within, I guess, their level of comfort? You know, is the task taking too long, or is it about right for what they expect? The last part of usability is often, is a experience satisfying? Now, we acknowledge that satisfying, you know, a satisfactory experience isn't always possible. You know, when you file a tax return, it's not usually a satisfying experience. But for a lot of things, you know, we want to go beyond that just efficient and effective, which is still fairly, you know, I don't know, it's sort of a, yeah, I can do it, to, hey, this was a great experience, I want to tell my friend about it.
I really like the quote that I pulled here from Patty Moore, who gave the closing keynote at UX Australia in 2016. And she said that accessibility is just the beginning. It's usability that makes the difference to somebody's experience. And that really, in my mind, sums up what we're trying to do here, move beyond something that can be used to something that is usable.
So who you might include.
So what we want to consider is, what are the potential barriers or areas of concern, and who might be affected. So if you've got some knowledge about how people with disabilities are using your products, using the web, using apps, using your software, then you probably have some ideas about this area may be difficult, but you're not sure. Think about the different types of users, but beware of what you don't know about your users. At the end of the day, you know, there's a wide variety of experience and ability between your different users. And the same applies to people with disabilities. So you don't know what you don't know, and just be aware of that as well. The other thing that we find here particularly is people are saying, you know, I want somebody who's blind because that's a visible disability. You know, they've seen people in the street with a guide dog or a white cane. They've seen people in the street with a wheelchair. They haven't seen people in the street, obviously, with dyslexia or cognitive disorders or stress or other types of things. So just a word of warning there, beware of that bias towards your client or yourself saying, okay, it's all about blindness and screen reader users. We still see that in a lot of the literature and write-up, that sort of bias.
When also talking about, you know, which users to choose, also recognise there is a great diversity in disability. So many disabilities are on a continuum. Low vision, for instance, can take a lot of forms. Perhaps you have narrow vision and only see, you know, a little bit in the centre. Perhaps you actually only have peripheral vision. So it's making sure that you have a range of people in those sort of disability categories, so to speak, and acknowledging that talking to one person with a disability is talking to one person with a disability. It doesn't mean that person is representative of all low vision users, for instance. Think about the difference in people with, say, a congenital disability versus someone who might have acquired a disability later on in life. That can often have quite an impact on their experience and also their technical proficiency with particular assistive technologies. There can also be differences related from age, technical proficiency, as I mentioned, culture, attitudes, and also literacy. So make sure that you consider that within your recruitment brief. And lastly, make sure that you do include testing on different types of technologies, so different devices, desktop, mobile, different platforms, iOS versus Android, and also then different assistive technologies as well, and adaptive strategies.
So the perennial question is, how many people should we include? The more people you include, the more insights you'll get, obviously. But at the end of the day, you need to be sure that you include enough people to increase your understanding of the usability of your product. One of the things that we often talk about with people that we're talking about, including people with disabilities in their group of usability participants in their general studies, is that many of us can just gloss over, and you know, when we're talking to people who are familiar with technology and every day on the web, you know, a little usability issue just becomes, you know, not even a minor annoyance to us. We know how to work around that because we're on the web or on the apps or in the game or whatever it might be all day, every day, working with the technology. Not everybody works in technology. Not everybody is using your app or somebody else's app and thing type every day. So what we have found is that what might be a minor annoyance to a lot of us can become have a major impact or become a major impediment to somebody who is using your product in a different way from the way that you do or many of us do. So something that's easy to do with a mouse might be much harder to do if you are using voice dictation or using just a keyboard to navigate. Something that may be obvious on the screen becomes much harder if you're listening to that screen in a linear fashion. You know, you've highlighted something in a certain way and we change the color scheme or we go to a high contrast mode, and those sorts of things become much less obvious because of the colors and the way they might become inverted in that high contrast mode. So it's little things like that that for some of us, they're very minor or not even apparent. They can become very apparent and become serious impediments for somebody with a disability interacting differently from the way I do with a keyboard and a mouse and you know, and putting on my reading glasses to make sure I can read the screen. Creating a better experience for people with disabilities is actually going to create a better experience for everybody, because you can get rid of those little minor annoyances that you know, they're barely aware of, and they'll get a better experience as well. The other thing to say here, you know, when we're saying that you know, some usability, including some people with disabilities, is better than including none, one of the arguments that many people who have had to argue internally that we've been working with is in Australia and in most developed countries, it's about 1 in 5. So using that statistic that comes from those national collections is one way of starting to get people with disabilities included in all the usability testing and user research that you're doing. So that's one way that we've found to help people get it as part of their business as usual. Okay, look, the statistics show it's 1 in 5. Let's do 1 in 5. It's hard for people to argue with that number because it's been collected based on, you know, national statistics, as I say. And after that, you can start to say, okay, well, these people are finding these usability issues. Let's increase the number, or increase the breadth or the depth of our users.
So we wanted to look at when to test for usability. So although today we're mainly talking about usability testing, we wanted to highlight including diverse users in your user research to understand needs, preferences, and opportunities. To do this, it can explore things like, for instance, what are users, you know, what do users need? If you're testing a system, you could actually do some research or testing on the current experience or service of either your company, so your product or maybe service, or perhaps even your competitors, to get that understanding to actually build into you know, new products. Also, have a think about, you know, what you can learn from research around system requirements. So we have an example here where our Australian government was researching into digital identification. They talked to a number of people who were blind and low vision, and, you know, it came out that, of course, most of them wouldn't have a driver's license, so they needed to include other identification methods within the system so that it didn't rely on, say, a driver's license. You can also include certain users with disabilities when you're doing testing prototypes or designs. This is very often overlooked. We find that most people are still doing usability testing with people with disability once the product has actually been designed and built. But there are definitely users that you can test a prototype with. So a prototype that doesn't have, say, some underlying semantics. So, you know, that something is a button or that kind of thing, or that needed adaptations to interfaces. So You could include users with, say, dyslexia or reading difficulty, users with some forms of low vision, such as screen magnification. You won't be able to include users with high contrast usually, but if it's just screen magnification, you can probably do that on a prototype or a design. Some forms of dexterity can also be tested on a prototype, or testing with neurodiverse users as well, just as a few examples. You will still need to be doing usability testing then as you build. So the likes of your screen reader user, voice control, like Dragon Naturally Speaking, keyboard only users, or people that do sort of change the UI, like high contrast, different fonts, that kind of thing. You will need sort of a working, build to do that. So you do need to make sure you can do that later on. I think what's interesting is we can look at, don't be limited by traditional usability testing methods. So although we've said, for instance, that you might not be able to test with screen readers when you have a prototype that's not semantic, think about other ways that you could actually be talking through or testing your designs. So for instance, co-design. I've actually had experience where I worked with someone who was blind, who was a screen reader user, and I would actually talk through the designs with him and sort of say, okay, we've got a control here. What would you expect it to announce? Is that label clear? Do we need to provide maybe an enhanced label to make it easier for you to understand, what this control does?
So with certain types of disabilities, as Sarah said, you might need to exclude some, and particularly certain types of assistive technologies when you're back at the design stage and you've only got clickable graphical screens. But you can increase the range of people that you're testing with and the technologies and their experience, particularly during build, once you've got HTML or apps in place. Definitely you should be testing at acceptance testing before you release. The one that people typically forget, though, is the issue of, okay, we're going to add a new feature, or we're going to completely rewrite this bit of content, which might mean some changes in the way that you interact with the page, the type of way you structure that page, and so on. So just do not forget that once it's gone live, you might need to worry about usability testing. You still need to test as you're adding features or adding major content revisions. The other advantage one of the advantages of people moving to an agile development is that as you are ready to release a process or a component that you might have built, you can be testing iteratively during that agile build. And it mightn't be every sprint, but it could be at the end of certain combinations of sprints where there's something new to add to the overall design that is going to be released, rather than waiting till the acceptance testing at the end. So that testing during the build is really important, so you can learn from that and say, okay, we made a mistake here. When we'll fix it, it can go into the backlog to be fixed, but you won't make that mistake with the next similar bit that you're building. Really, really important in Agile.
So next up, we want to talk about what you might consider when planning a session. So the first thing is location. Do you go to your place? Or I should say, do you go to the participant's place, or do they come to yours? Usually it is always good to do testing within their environment and also with their technology as well. They will have their own setup, they will be comfortable at home. I do know of users that we work with who aren't comfortable going to, say, other people's offices or, usability testing places or labs, So if you can go to their place and that is preferable for them, then definitely do support that. I know, though, it's not always possible. We work with a lot of organisations where, things are still locked down. They're only available internally within their office. So, there are always going to be situations where you can't accommodate that. So make sure if you are doing testing in a remote location that it is easy to get to and preferably close to public transport if people do want to take public transport. Also, the place, of course, needs to be accessible. So that doesn't just include the room. You want to look at, say, accessible bathrooms, doors, corridors, that kind of thing, making sure that there's enough room for people to get in, making sure there is enough room for a guide dog or someone to come along with the user if that is what they prefer.
So the room itself, as Sarah started to allude to, you know, can you get the wheelchair through the door? When I'm standing, you know, I can open the door and close it behind me, but sometimes, you know, if the facility is a smaller room that you've got available, you know, getting that wheelchair through, or the person with their guide dog or assistance dog, if the door opens in a certain way or to the left rather than the right, it may be difficult to get in and get to the where you've might have the place set up. Some other things to account for on this one are what sort of adjustments can you make? Some people find bright light is going to be just too glary for them with their particular vision impairment or other cognitive impairment. Some people with the strobing that can happen with fluorescent lights is going to, you know, just stop them from being able to participate or complete the task because it, you know, can cause that concentration issue or can cause headaches. Can you adjust that lighting? Table height, you know, if you've got somebody of short stature or somebody who's extra tall like my nephew, you know, are they going to be comfortable sitting at your standard desk that isn't adjustable in any way? Are they going to be able to reach the devices you might have available for them?
And part of the room setup is also sort of touches on recruitment, which is checking if a user, for instance, has something, say a wheelchair that is slightly larger than normal. So I actually heard, I wasn't involved with this session, but I heard of a session where someone came to do, actually wasn't related to usability testing with people with disability. She just happened to be coming for a session and she had a slightly larger than normal wheelchair. And although the venue that this organisation was using actually met the building code, the wheelchair actually couldn't get through the door. So it's also being prepared for those kind of things, and, you know, almost as part of that recruitment, checking for that kind of thing so that you can be prepared.
So in terms of planning, how are you going to observe and record the session? You can't rely on traditional recording methods necessarily because they may interfere with the way that person uses their technology. So traditionally with you know, a mobile phone app, it'll be attached, you'll have a camera over it so that people can tap on that. If a person with a disability needs to be listening to that, they may need to lift that up to their ear. They may have low vision and they hold it close to their face so that they can see it more clearly because they've got central vision but no peripheral vision, so they bring it right up close. So, you know, the traditional recording method, as we say there, may interfere with their use of the technology. It also may not show important aspects such as keyboard navigation and what keyboard strokes they might be using. So if you're just recording what's going on screen, that isn't necessarily representative of how they may be interacting. So we need to make sure that we can record these things because that's part of their way that they use their device and the experience that you actually are wanting to observe and interpret when you come to write this up and say, okay, what are the implications for how this user interacts with our product? So we've always said that it's important to have a note taker and an observer in the room. So that note taker will be taking notes about what they might be saying or important phrases. As a facilitator, you shouldn't be trying to take notes and facilitate the session. But that observer should also be recording those human interactions. You know, does the person winced because they might be in pain because of how they've had to hold the device for such a long length of time, or something like this that has some impact on their usability and the satisfaction that they'll get at the end of using your product.
So like any standard usability session, people should be compensated for their time. Make sure the incentives and also the incentive process are easy to claim and also accessible. So gift cards tend to not be terribly accessible. You know, often they have the code on the back. You might need to scratch it off. You need to read the code. For someone that's blind, you know, they need to get someone else to be able to read that code in order to be able to use the gift card. So think about the method that you're using to sort of give that incentive. The claims process is in relation to our last point about including a travel allowance for all users. So for a lot of people with disability, they might be using taxis or that to get around. That might be the easiest way for them to get there. And they shouldn't be out of pocket if you are conducting usability testing at your organisation or at a test lab. So make sure that you include that travel allowance for users, but also make sure that it is easy for them to claim that, or that it is just a flat amount that you give to everyone, irrespective of what, you know, travel method they use.
The non-disclosure agreement and the consent are particularly important here. Often they're just handed out when somebody rocks up at the usability session. They're expected to read it, understand it, sign it, job done. For a lot of people with disability, they may have difficulty understanding what the terms are in there. They may not be able to see your paper form that you're expecting them to sign. So it's really, really important that it's shared beforehand and that you plan to share this beforehand once you've signed the people up, and that they've got enough time then to review and understand and complete. So that document shouldn't be an image PDF, for instance, or even a piece of paper that you put in the post. Traditionally, that you might send out. It needs to be an accessible electronic document that can be shared with them so that they can listen to it if they need to listen to it, rather than read it visually. It must be in plain English. The number of times where we've had the experience of having to explain to the person who turns up the legalese, and Sarah's had, you know, this experience particularly in a couple of instances.
Yeah, I think one of the times where I was just doing the testing, hadn't done the recruitment, a person with cognitive impairment came in, and I said, "Oh, have you read the consent form?" And he said no, and I said, "Oh, would you mind reading it now?" And he read it out aloud, the whole form, and it was a very, very technical document. So often, unfortunately, legal, doesn't like to use plain English. And in this case, we hadn't won that fight with this particular consent form. And he read it to the end, and he turned to me and he said, "So what did that mean?" So I think I acted as the human easy read version then, and I sort of tried to paraphrase what each of those clauses meant. And he was happy to sign the consent form, but it was certainly not the ideal situation.
And apologies to those of you who might be watching from non-English as your first language destinations, locations. We really mean plain language. In Australia, we are very focused on English as the only language that's recognised here, unfortunately. And so we tend to use terms here that change plain English to plain language.
And it's a good point. If you have people where English is the second language, you may want to provide translated versions of that consent form as well.
So facilitation, it's really important that the facilitators, the observers, and anybody else who's going to be involved in the session, the person who might be meeting and greeting the person at reception, is familiar with inclusive language, disability etiquette, and then in the session itself have some familiarity with the assistive technologies and adaptive strategies that the individual may use, so that the person feels comfortable, feels included, and you're not offending them in any way whatsoever about how you interact with them, speak to them, and make assumptions about their technology. If you've got any issues about this, there's a lot of disability organisations here in Australia, and I will assume it's common in other countries, that offer disability awareness training, and it is really worthwhile going through that training if you're not working with people with disabilities on a regular basis and building that understanding already.
And I think, you know, like with all facilitation, you need to know that sometimes things don't go to plan. I was in a session where we were using what we felt was the right inclusive language, and someone really took offence, you know, at the language that we used. And I was actually working with some user researchers who I was there sort of supporting as they were learning how to work with people with disabilities. And the facilitator was great. She thanked the person for sharing that, you know, apologised if she caused any offence, and, you know, sort of then used that language that this particular participant preferred. So, you know, like with any session, sometimes, you know,
things go wrong.
Things go wrong, or stuff happens, or people have a personal preference, and you just roll with that and be respectful.
So in preparing your script, sometimes you're given a script by the organisation if you're coming in just to facilitate the usability with people with disabilities. And often they won't be necessarily asking the types of questions that you need to ask, or about the things that you need to ask to be able to understand the usability issues for a person who might be using the computer in a different way from the other participants that they might have got in. You know, so sometimes it's important to be able to ask, and you need to ask the person, are they comfortable if you do ask these questions, and make it very clear that they're free not to answer or give a short answer rather than a long answer, you know, about what works or what doesn't work, what is the impact of their disability on their use of technology, the impact of their disability on their day-to-day life, because you might be probing about the end-to-end process, which may be partly online and partly you know, in the physical environment. It's really important that if you can tease out some of that stuff, it can help you in your understanding about what the usability issues that you're observing in the session, how they relate to the person's overall use of technology and you know, and the day-to-day life, as we said. What is it you want to test? Being quite clear about having some prompts in there, because if you just let them explore, you ask them to do a task, but you've got some areas of concern that you've already identified. If you don't guide them in that direction, you may miss out on those insights that you're really wanting to get. So be prepared to not just follow the script that might have been handed to you, but being able to adapt that to be sure that you can guide. There's always concerns about how much you guide versus how much is left for them to explore, but often we want to find out particular areas where we think there may be problems. So we do need to guide them in that right direction to be sure that we can explore those areas.
And sometimes that might mean letting the user complete the task in the way they want, and then perhaps ask them to sort of complete that same task, taking a different path, so that they can go down that path. Once you've got to the sort of on that path, you can leave them alone again and, you know, sort of just go back to observation, and, you know, so that you do actually get that feedback on that task.
One important thing that we found with some users is that they don't want to, well, they can't or don't want to rely on their memory when you've asked them to what the next task is going to be. So having a printout of the script, often in a simplified or easy read version, without all the detail that you might have had in how the script's been written for yourself, and also possibly having a large printout, or, and we haven't had this, but we've had and anticipated it sometimes, you know, maybe a Braille version, so that the person can follow along in what's printed rather than relying on you and their memory of what you've said and asked them to do. So how do we recruit participants? A number of different ways. There's increasing number of organisations that are creating specialist panels now. We've listed some that we've talked to on the screen here: Fable in Canada, Utopia Connect here in Australia and New Zealand, Nobilities Access Works, Lighthouse in San Francisco in the US, Open Inclusion in the UK. These people have panels already with a variety of people with disabilities, but sometimes you want to just do your own recruitment. And just go to the local disability organisation in your area and ask if they've got some people, and make it clear when you're asking that you're going to reimburse them. So you aren't asking people to volunteer, you're asking them to come along for a short job, if you like. Go out on social media and word of mouth. Once you've recruited a few people locally, they'll often have friends, relatives, colleagues with disabilities that you can start to build your own internal panel. The other place to find participants, if you're an inclusive employer, is some of your employees will have disabilities that may be recorded by HR, and you can go to your HR department and ask if there's anybody on staff. But being aware that a lot of people with disabilities don't self-declare to their employer.
Also be aware, if you do use your internal staff, that they have their day jobs. I've been in organisations where some people are more than happy to participate in a session if it's not too onerous. Others, though, they're like, well, look, this is not my job. It's taking away from my core job. Do be aware that if you are using mainstream recruitment agencies, be very clear about the recruitment requirements that you need, and make sure that that agency does have the right sort of skills to be able to recruit someone.
What sort of technology? It's better for participants to use their own technology because if they're using any assistive technologies, they will probably have made some customizations in there, set some preferences, and if you're expecting them to use a screen reader on your machine, then you're not going to have it set up the way that they expect. Generally, we invite people to bring their own technology to the sessions, but make sure you have a backup plan if the technology fails. And that's not uncommon. The number of times that somebody's come along to a session that I've run, they've brought their own device, they've got their own screen reader, and for one reason or another, it does not want to work in the location where we're running this technology, the session. And fortunately, I've made sure that I've got the same version on my machine so that we can just swap over.
If a user, if you do have to use your own technology, so you can't ask a participant, say, to bring their own technology, make sure the participant is okay with this at recruitment. It's not everyone who's going to be comfortable using a completely new computer or mobile phone. As Andrew said, they might have their own customizations as well. Do also add a bit extra time to the session as well, so that you can do some tech setup with them, and also so that they can just have a little bit of a play to become comfortable with the technology.
So we said earlier on that you want to make sure that your participant is comfortable. You need to understand what accommodations they might need, what requirements they might have. For example, they may need some breaks to just recover their energy. They may need some lighting adjustments. We've talked about that. They may have certain personal interaction preferences. They may not want to shake hands with you, which is our conventional way in the Western world of greeting people. They may need an interpreter because of their languages or their lack of literacy. That interpreter may even have to be a sign language person. In Australia will be somebody who can speak Auslan with them, because they may not have, they may be very, very hard of hearing or totally deaf. They may be bringing a companion or support worker with them. They may have an assistance dog or a guide dog that may need some water. So all these things you need to take into account, and some of them may need to allow some additional cost because it may not be part of their the type of support that they regularly have available.
So logistics include in confirmation emails sort of where they need to go, and make sure that any instructions about how to get to the building have considered, all the accessible pathways that they might need. When the session is, date, time, length, traditionally arrive 15 minutes early. Who to contact on the day. So if they get delayed or are lost or need assistance, they can contact someone who is there at the actual, where you're conducting the testing. It's very common for us to get a call and have someone say, yeah, I'm sort of on the street. I think I'm in the vicinity, but could you come down and find me? And who will meet them?
So just a few hints about running the itself. Particularly somebody who's blind or has low vision, introducing who's in the room and explaining the different roles. You know, the facilitator, you're going to be running the session, but you might have an observer, you might have some other people present from the design team or the development team. So just making sure that the person is comfortable with those people. Explain to them what to expect, how the session's going to be run, confirm the consent, and it's just polite to advise them that they can stop at any time because they need to take a break, or they don't really want to continue at this point because they're feeling uncomfortable for whatever reason. Make that very, very clear at the outset.
One of the things to plan for is, what happens if a user encounters a barrier? So there's two schools of thought around usability testing. It's sort of stop the task there. If a user encounters a barrier they can't get past, or move the person on so that you can still get feedback on, about the rest of the process. Most of the people we work with, are happy with the moving someone past that barrier. But, if someone is an assistive technology user, you need to have some familiarity with that in order to be able to guide them past that, provide instructions that are going to be right for them. And on the odd occasion, if they can't get past it, always ask, could I please, sort of jump in and, move you past this particular barrier.
Okay, and then what have you found? How are you going to report these findings? How are you going to identify issues? Now, you need to differentiate between what the user would like to see, what their personal preferences might be, and what they actually need to do. You might need to remedy in order to allow them to do the job at all. So differentiating between users that are caused by poor usability or poor design, issues that are caused by technical errors such as poor coding, errors that are caused by the assistive technology support, and across screen readers, across different devices, there's a whole range of different assistive technology supports in the way something's put together between an Android phone, an iOS phone, and different operating systems and browsers. And then the user's knowledge of how to use the technology as well can be something that can be seen as a problem if you don't understand how the technology is all supposed to work. We've in particular seen issues with table navigation. It's very common that people have difficulty navigating tables because they're not in tables every day. So it's not their experience.
Sometimes, when things are more complex, like we have done testing where someone has used the ARIA design pattern for tabs, and it was coded up perfectly, but nearly all of our users, because it was a new pattern, they didn't actually know how to use it. So we had to make a call as to whether we used that pattern or whether it was something we changed to something a little bit more old school. And in that case, because the majority of the users couldn't use it, we did actually choose to actually do the old school method.
And there's a couple of schools of thought here. The chicken and the egg. How long do you wait before you move to something that is actually more efficient and rely on users catching up versus making sure that they can use the product? A lot of discussion happens there, and just be aware that a lot of usability issues won't map to WCAG fails, but some of them will, and you need to be able to identify those so that they can be addressed in particular. And also, assigning severity. Is it something that's critical that stops somebody from doing it, or is it just their personal preference because they find blue easier to read than green, and that works for them, but may not be representative of people with their similar disability?
So we wanted to sort of end on, if you do test with one user, you have tested with one user. And that, I think, can be seen in a positive way, in the sense of, organisations are starting to test with people with disabilities, but, we do need to be careful to say, we can't just have one screen reader user or one low vision user. It will tell us something, but it certainly won't be representative of a range of users that will give us much, much more richer feedback.
Thanks. I'm aware that we've got a little bit over time, but I think there's probably still some time for questions.
Yes, there is. Yeah. So thank you, Sarah and Andrew. That was a really interesting presentation on something that I think many people don't really know how to even get started thinking about. And there's so many things to think about that people running usability testing might not even be aware of. So I've got a few questions for you. Start with what's your opinion on the value of panels of expert testers?
I think they can have their place. I think that they absolutely can identify some of the accessibility and usability issues that someone may encounter. It does tend to be, an expert tester tends to usually have a higher technical proficiency and also be much more familiar with the testing process. So they're certainly not representative of the person off the street. So I think you can include it as part of your testing, and it can be really good if you're doing early testing to use an expert tester to get that early feedback. But I wouldn't say that is to the exclusion of usability testing, which gives you a much, much broader representation of users, a lot more different experiences, and all of those things we talked about, technical proficiency, age, that actually play a role in how someone is going to interact and what their experience is.
Great, thank you. So as you said, you need to test any new features that you're rolling out. If a feature is going to be implemented across multiple pages, it could be hundreds, thousands, millions of pages, depending on the size of the site, would you recommend testing within the page context and not just in isolation? And if so, can you suggest any strategies for this?
Absolutely, it's in context that the person is going to encounter this. That said, it is very much worthwhile testing the component that's going to be introduced in its own right, to be sure that different types of people with different experiences and different disabilities can actually interact with it per se. But then it's you really do need to put it into context to show how. To get that experience about how somebody's going to use that in the context of where you're going to place it in 1 page, 10 pages, 100 pages. And you're not going to test all 100 pages. You're going to test a couple of representative examples, of course, but context is everything when it comes to putting a widget or whatever new feature that you're going to do into your website or your mobile app.
And that's where you might actually use your expert testers to test that component individually, which is almost to say, hey, is this working as expected? But then more do your usability testing in that with that component in context.
Right. So perhaps use the usability testing to make sure that it is working as expected for the majority of people, and then the experts to just confirm that, and that maybe they might have suggestions to improve it. Would that be your approach? Something like that?
Yeah, probably bringing in the expert users first to test the new module, and then do a broader range of testing with it in context.
Right. Yes. This is something I was thought when being involved in commissioning testing is you want to make sure that the most difficult part that you're doing, the broad usability testing, isn't basically testing things that you could have found out in a easier way. It's like if your testing is basically uncovering the fact that you haven't labeled a button, then you haven't really made the most of it. So
that's right. There's not a lot of point in bringing somebody in to find those things for you that you should have found. You're wasting your time. You're wasting their time as well. Yeah.
I don't disagree, but I have had situations. So usually we would advise, WCAG sort of technical issues, WCAG issues should be fixed before you do usability testing. Having said that, there are definitely certain scenarios where there are exceptions. So a particular organisation I'm working with has a white labelled product, and they're not in control of the fixes. So they're doing a combination of both technical testing and usability testing to say, okay, so we know that they've got technical issues, but based on usability, here's actually usability issues, some of which are WCAG, some of which are not. Let's actually create a prioritized list based on both of these inputs. And there's definitely times where that can work well when, for instance, yeah, you're trying to convince people that things need to be fixed. It might not be in your control. So it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all method to me.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that takes us to the end of our time.
It certainly does. And on that note, a big thank you to our gold supporters, Intopia and Barclays Access, our silver supporters at Siteimprove and Adobe, and our bronze supporters at Samsung Internet, DQ Systems, and the Paciello Group, without whose help this event probably would not happen, and certainly not in the way we'd like it to. Quick reminder that if you enjoyed Sarah and Andrew's talk, please head over to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 and hit that like button. And while you're there, why not subscribe to the channel so you get future notifications. We'll be right back on the hour, this time with Kerry Fisher, who will be talking about accessible design patterns from the ground up. So don't go away.